Welcome, everyone. Welcome to RNS's webinar, American Jews in Israel, A Changing Political Landscape. My name is Yilnat Shimron. I'm a national reporter and a senior editor here at RNS. We'll get started in a minute or two. Please feel free to put your name in the comments. Let us know who you are and where you're watching from. Okay, we have Gabrielle, great, from Baltimore. Robin from LA, great, thank you for joining. Richard Minsky, hello, thank you for coming from Stockport. And Jeanette from my hometown of Durham, North Carolina. Yay. Great. Thank you all for joining us. I want to thank RNS, my employer, for hosting this webinar. RNS is an independent nonprofit news organization that provides objective, in-depth religion reporting and commentary by a team of professional journalists. RNS is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. And today's webinar underscores our mission to improve understanding and foster discussion about religion, all religions and no religion, and beliefs in everyday life. Our journalism is available for free on our website and through our podcasts, newsletters, and social media. We also partner with mainstream media outlets to deliver news. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Religion News Foundation, which is a 501c3. We're a nonprofit. And to learn more about RNS, visit rns.org. So please feel free to put questions that you may have into the Q&A section. We'll open it up to questions at the very end of the webinar, and you can put your comments in the comment box. We'll be adding some links in there too to books and articles that are going to be mentioned here. Also, if you miss parts of it or you can't make it, there will be a recording that will be made after the webinar concludes, and we can send you a link to that. Okay, I'm going to get started. So it's been 9 months since Israel launched its war on Gaza in response to the October 7th attacks on Israel led by Hamas. The casualties are many. There are 12,000 Israeli casualties. There's an enormous and disproportionate number of Palestinian casualties, something close to 40,000, with about 80,000 injured. Gaza itself is in shambles, and many of its civic institutions, its schools and hospitals and mosques and universities have been destroyed. This is the longest war in Israel's history, and it has another casualty too, which is the American Jewish community, which has fractured and divided over the war. American Jews at first responded with an overwhelming outpouring of love and sympathy for those Israelis that were killed along Israel's southern border with Gaza. But as the war has gone on, it has really divided the American Jews. Although we know that 81% of American Jews say they're emotionally attached to Israel, according to a poll that was done in April by the Jewish Electoral Institute. We also know that a growing number of younger Jews are becoming detached. And even back in February, a Pew poll showed that 42% of Jews under the age of 35 found Israel's military response unacceptable. Since then, many young Jews have camped out at Gaza solidarity encampments on college campuses and have shown support for Palestinians and demanded that universities divest from Israel. These younger Jews see Israel as an occupying power, and they have very negative feelings about its military conduct. So today we're going to talk about about American Jews and Israel and its changing political landscape with two experts who know this topic very well. Daniel Sokach is the CEO of the New Israel Fund since 2009. During the past decade, the New Israel Fund has supported and funded organizations that promote justice, democracy, and equality in Israel. Before joining the INF, Daniel served as the CEO of the the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. Prior to his tenure in the Federation, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, which is now called Bend the Arc. Daniel has been named multiple times to the Forward 500, an annual list of the 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers. And he's also the author of the book, Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted, which I've personally found to be very enlightening. And we also have with us Rabbi Alyssa Weiss. She is an organizer, ritual leader, and an organizational steward. She is currently the lead organizer and founder, I believe, of Rabbis for Ceasefire. She was a staff leader at Jewish Voice for Peace from 2011 to 2021. And she served there as co-director of organizing, interim executive director, and deputy director. She facilitates and coaches human rights and movement building, NGOs, and is the author of an upcoming book that is called Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing, which is forthcoming in September from Haymarket Books. So let's start with Daniel. Daniel, State of Israel has enjoyed overwhelming support from American Jews since 1967, when Israel overran the armies of 3 Arab countries in 6 days and captured a lot of territory, including the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. In your book, Can We Talk About Israel? You describe finding a 1967 Life magazine cover story in a used bookstore that featured a photo of a handsome Israeli soldier. And you say that you were initially found the image hopeful and innocent and seductive, and you put it up on your wall. But now the meaning of that image has changed for you. So tell us a little bit about why you and other American Jews were so mesmerized by Israel initially, and how that's changed.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on the webinar. Just a slight correction, I just because I think that numbers in these at times like these are loaded, and I think you did a slight misspeak earlier. It's 1,200 Israeli casualties to date.
That's right. 1,200
instead of 12,000. And that was the toll from October 7th, and then over 300 soldiers have died in Gaza since then, and something that's very close to 39,000 Palestinians are the numbers. And so just wanted to make sure that we're all operating from some shared data, because everything. No, it's like, again, a simple misspeaking can trigger a lot of reaction. So this This is why it's such a controversial topic. It was 1986, and I was in a used bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, like thumbing through. I don't even know what I was doing, looking through these magazine covers. I'd never read Life magazine, and I saw this cover, and it's just as you described. And in my book, the illustrator Christopher Noxon did a great picture of it. I don't know if you can see it. That's just a pen and ink version of the Life cover. And yeah, everything you said so eloquently is how I felt. I was a freshman in college, and I found that to be the most, as you said, sort of exciting, even seductive, but also pride-inducing image. And it goes, I think, to where many of us in the American Jewish community, I was a whatever I was, a 18 or 19-year-old kid, and I had been raised in a family in Cincinnati, Ohio, that was not particularly connected to Israel or to Zionism, but we had gone when I was 16 on a trip to Israel where we had family, and the other three members of my immediate family thought, oh, that was interesting, and for me, that was it. I was completely beguiled by everything I saw, and I think was very much probably the last generational product of a story about Israel that we as an American Jewish community, for lots of reasons, told ourselves, and that Israel told itself, that while it contained truths, was not the whole story. And parenthetically, I always think of the story of Israel-Palestine, and this conflict reminds me of the parable of the blind men and the elephant. These 10 blind men stumble across an elephant in the jungle, and each one touches a part of the elephant and therefore understands what an elephant is and says, well, an elephant is a long, sinuous trunk-like appendage, or a tree trunk-like leg, or a floppy ear. And of course, what we know, what they can't see literally, is that the elephant is those things, but it's much more than those things. And what's poignant about the parable for me, even today, is that they're not wrong. It's just that they're also not right. And so I was a person raised, like most American Jews, on the trunk and the leg of the elephant, and I had no understanding or knowledge of the ear or the tail. I'll stop with the metaphor because it will become distracting, except to say that I think one of the things we see in much of the discourse in America today are great partisans of the trunk and the tail arrayed against great partisans of the ear and the leg, without a lot of understanding or empathy for the entire elephant. Putting that aside, so there I am. I find this thing, and it's just the Israel that I wanted to believe in, this handsome soldier. And I put it up on my wall. And as years passed, I began to feel different about it. And as your question suggests, I think that was in line with the trajectory of a lot of people of my generation who cared a lot about Israel. Because I began to realize as I became older and went to college, or studied this in college and went to graduate school and found work in this area, that the story that I understood was only part of the elephant. And lots of things about the picture then began to make me feel uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with the celebration of sort of militarism, which had been, exciting to me as a young person, thinking, well, that was the salvation of the Jewish people, and look at this strong face. And in 20 some odd years after the Holocaust, this is the face of the Jewish people. That sort of changed into questions about why we should celebrate sort of militarism. It might be something that is necessary, but surely not something to celebrate or idealize. But really, the challenge came as I began to realize that for me, that moment, the moment that's captured in that photograph of an Israeli soldier, I'm looking at it on my wall. That's why I'm glancing up there. That moment was also the moment when, for many of us, and certainly for me, the story of Israel, when you look historically, took a huge turn. Now, we can talk a lot about the origins of Israel and the founding of Israel and what that meant for the Palestinians who were dispossessed and uprooted. But there's a different chapter that begins when Israel occupies, as you said earlier, all this territory, in particular, the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza for our purposes. And so I began to see that photograph as sort of the beginning of the end of a period in Israel's history that was only 19 years long, where things were not clear and not uncomplicated, but they were different than they were afterwards, when Israel became, for over half a century, an occupying power. And decades passed, and I kept it on my wall, but I felt strange about it. And one day, a friend of mine, a colleague from Israel, this is while I'm now the CEO of New Israel Fund, a major leader of the LGBTQ and civil rights and human rights movement in Israel. And he looked at the picture on my wall and he said, well, it's interesting that you have this up on your wall, because for all the reasons that I'd come to. And I sort of said, well, I keep it up there to remind myself of the complications and the complexity and the emotional attachment and the whole elephant. Lots of things are true at once. And the picture now makes me uncomfortable in a way that it used to make me comforted. And I keep it there for that reason. And he sort of thoughtfully nodded and said, And a few weeks later, I got a package in the mail. And in the package was another piece of art, which I'm looking at right now. And here is the artist's reproduction of it. It's by a well-known Israeli queer photographer and artist called Adi Ness. He reimagines that picture. And here you see the handsome young Israeli soldier in the Suez Canal, but surrounded by these sort of hunky men. And he turned this iconic image, which stood for many things in the minds of Israelis, into something that was subversive and in many ways critical of Israeli society, while embracing the possibility of another Israeli society. And he questioned masculinity and he questioned militarism. And I just thought it was great. And so now I have both of those pictures hanging up on the wall, because I'm trying in my life and in my career to assemble as best I can the full elephant. I think that has been what many people in the American Jewish community have tried to do over the last decades and over the last 9 months in an extraordinarily accelerated fashion, come to terms with the fact that the Israel that they thought they knew is not the Israel necessarily that exists, that there are a lot of grays and complications, and that many things can be true at the same time. And that when it comes to this conflict, there are no blacks and whites, there are shades of gray, and a terrible, terrible dearth of imagination and empathy.
Great, thank you. And tell us, just walk us briefly through the arc of Jewish history post 1967. Let's say, beginning with the war in Lebanon in 1982, that began to tarnish Israel's international standing, and where Americans also too began to question the conduct of its government and military.
Well, in classic Jewish fashion, I'll slightly disobey your instructions just to say, if you go back further, earlier, Israel's founded in 1948, and the movement, the political Zionist movement that built the pre-state structure that came into being in May 1948 during Israel's War of Independence, which was for the Palestinians, the Nakba, the catastrophe of their dispossession. American support for the Zionist project was not a given in those days. In fact, it was not until after World War II that the American Jewish institutions aligned in support of Israel. Many American Jews were anti-Zionist, who they felt that Israel, that the claim that there needed to be a Jewish state undermined their presence in America. Many would argue, most recently, Gershom Gorenberg, a very smart author, in a piece he wrote in Moment magazine last week, that there was a lot of privilege in the argument that because things are good in America, Jews don't need in Israel. But there was not a consensus of support. And that really emerged after World War II, when America found itself the great center of the Jewish world, with the decimated, for 2 millennia, the center of the Jewish world was in Europe. That was gone. Israel was a tiny gleam in the eyes of the Zionists, several 100,000 people in Israel. And America was the place which was the center of the Jewish world. And struggling to figure out how to deal with two things: the reality of the disaster of the Holocaust and the looming challenge of assimilation, right? The fact that Jews had it so good in America, obviously not without challenges and anti-Semitism, but nothing like at any other point, in any other place, at any other moment in the history of the Jewish people. The entire North American Jewish project has been unique in that sense, and extraordinary in that sense. And they knew they were facing, in the years after World War II, what they saw as the challenge of assimilation. If Jews really can be anyone that they want to be in America, like, what are we going to do to build some sense of Jewish identity? And for them, the obvious choice was this other issue, which was the terrible need of the survivors of the Holocaust and a million people in DP camps, and this growing but still nascent Jewish community in Palestine, not yet Israel. And they turned and predicated a sense of communal identity on support for that project, that Zionist project. And that went swimmingly until now I get to your question, and I'll be very brief in answering it. In 1967, it was before I was around, but when you talk to people who were young people then, the sense, or not young, American Jews were infused with a sense of pride in an Israel that could defend itself and defend the Jewish people, with the Holocaust just 2 decades earlier in brilliant, vivid living memory of young adults and middle-aged and older American Jews. And so support for Israel really rose and rose and rose until that moment that you cite, which is the first Lebanon War. In 1982, Israel, the conventional wisdom suggests that that's the first war of Israel's choosing. I would argue that that's a not totally inaccurate depiction, and ignores 1956 and the Sinai campaign. But in any event, in the popular sort of narrative, Israel chose to invade Lebanon to kick out the PLO, which had been kicked out of Jordan into Lebanon, and had formed a state within a state there. And frankly, that invasion went very, very badly in a lot of ways. It mired Israel down for decades in Lebanon, and it resulted in a moment that seared the Israeli imagination and that of many Jews around the world. And those were the massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, where Palestinian civilian refugees were murdered in their hundreds. We don't even know the full number, by Christian militiamen from the Phalangists, allies of Israel, Lebanese allies of the Israeli army, while the Israeli army had a cordon. They were occupying and surrounding Beirut at that point, and they allowed these militiamen into the camps, where they rampaged and slaughtered innocent people. And the reaction in Israel was total revulsion. It was the largest mass movement in Israel's history. It brought the downfall of the Begin Sharon government at that time, and it launched Peace Now and the peace movement in Israel. And in America, lots of Jews for the first time said, hold on a second, maybe this isn't the country I thought it was. Rescuing Jews from terrorists in Entebbe, or protecting Jews who were coming from the DP camps of Europe or North African and Middle Eastern countries. And again, here we have the elephant. Those things were true, but the other thing was true. Israel had executed a war of choice, and people began thinking, the Palestinian issue became more and more on the radar screen for American Jews. This is something that was not discussed, but began to be discussed, right? What did happen at Israel's origin? Right? What happened to the 750,000 Palestinians who were kicked out or fled at Israel's origin? What does it mean for the Jewish people in establishing their state to be the agents of dispossession of another people? And that question hadn't even been engaged. Now, engaging that question engages and embraces the complexities I spoke about earlier. But we were, as a Jewish community, not trained to think about Israel even the way we now think about America. You could hate one of the political parties in this country, despise the direction that party is taking the country, but not feel that you can't still love and care about your community and your country. But that nuance, that sort of ability to deal with the cognitive dissonance between a government and political leaders and a people and a concept, that nuance was not explored in the Jewish community in America. And as such, as time went by, and in 1987, the first Intifada, or Palestinian uprising against the occupation, broke out, first in Gaza, then in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And then came the Oslo peace process, which raised hopes that were shattered by an assassin's bullet. People like to say that the peace process between the PLO and Israel was doomed to failure. We'll never know if it was doomed to failure, because Jewish terrorists murdered the prime minister, and Palestinian terrorists murdered Jewish civilians, and settlers on the West Bank continued to settle land that was not part of sovereign Israel and dispossess Palestinians there. And we end up through this sort of parade of horribles since the hope of the 90s at the terrible situation where we are now, where a lot of people wake up to a problem, a crisis, a horror show, but because of the elephant, for some people, it's like they're watching a zombie movie, and suddenly zombies invaded a perfectly innocent place and slaughtered people, and they can't understand why the world is upset at the response of the victims of the zombie attack. And on the other side, people say there's been over half a century of occupation and oppression, and finally things exploded. And what are you surprised at? Now, I don't spare a lot of time or thought for the people on either side who justify or rationalize or celebrate the violence at all, anyone. And in particular, when it's violence against civilians. I think that those are immoral and unconscionable positions, whether it's the civilians dead in Gaza or the civilians dead in Israel. But the fact that we have people who have taken these hardened positions now based on an understanding, a limited understanding of a partial story is, I think, part of the challenge in the American discourse. And in the American Jewish community, we have seen, as you said, a younger generation walking away from Israel for reasons that I completely understand, because Israel looks less and less like the story they were told, and more like a place. And here, for the viewers, this is an editorial comment on my part. You know, most American Jews, well, this part is not. American Jews are liberal. They overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party, and they have liberal values. And they are now beginning to see in the months, I would argue, not just the last 9 months, but the last 18 months, because in the year or the 9 months before October 7th, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is comprised of radical right-wing, I'm going to call them the MAGA party of Benjamin Netanyahu, a cult of personality party for the prime minister, the ultra-Orthodox parties and the Jewish supremacist settler parties launched Israel on a path towards the dissolution of its democracy. They tried to essentially destroy the Supreme Court. There was a mass uprising of Israelis that prevented that from happening. The horror of October 7th changed the narrative. Now those divides in Israeli society still exist, but American Jews again see a black and white picture of a situation that is far more complex, but one can understand why young liberal American Jews want nothing to do with the Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu. You know, part of what I argue is that's if you're only seeing the ear of the elephant there. There is a civil rights struggle going on in Israel right now, an existential struggle for the soul and future of that place. And there are Palestinian and Jewish participants who want our help. So I see my job as being an emissary of that third way. But I'm not at all surprised that young American Jews are walking away from an Israel that they have been told is one thing, which is not that thing. It's a much more complex thing. And frankly, for the last 15 years, the political leadership of that Israel has been going in a direction that's antithetical to many American Jewish values. And they don't know about that other Israel that exists, just like if you were to say, well, America's just red states or it's just blue states.
Thank you. Rabbi Lissa, tell me a little bit about how you grew up, what your views of Israel were when you started rabbinical school or maybe later, and why you joined Jewish Voice for Peace.
Sure. Well, it's interesting, Daniel. I didn't know this, but we are both from Cincinnati, Ohio.
Come on.
When you said that, I wanted to interrupt and be like, me too.
For those of you who are not from Cincinnati, the question whether you like the black raspberry chip or the chocolate chip or the mint chip means nothing, but for us it means something.
Yes,
sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, so my family's story of getting to Cincinnati is an interesting one and revealing of my lineage. So I'll share it quickly, which is that on my father's side, my family moved from Lithuania to Palestine in 1809. So before the Zionist movement really began. And when they settled there, they were first lived inside the walls of the old city and the Jewish quarter, and then later became some of the first Jewish settlers outside the walls of the old city, and were one of the 7 families that founded Nachalat Shiva in Jerusalem. And my great-grandfather was being drafted into the Ottoman army and during the First World War and didn't want to go. And there was this wealthy American studying in his yeshiva, in his study house in Jerusalem, who said, I'll help you immigrate to the US and set you up with a job in my family's business, which was a kosher food distribution business headquartered in Cincinnati, and that person was Herschel Manischewitz. And you might have heard of Manischewitz once or twice. So my first uncle is named Herschel after Herschel. So that's how my family got to Cincinnati, and my family were kosher food distributors, and we were in in Cincinnati, the birthplace of the Reform movement with the last name Wise, we were Orthodox Jews, modern Orthodox Jews in Cincinnati. And I grew up going to Jewish day school and Jewish summer camps, and I was a leader in Jewish youth movements and was very much a very proud Zionist for my youth. And that's how I kind of developed my leadership skills and got engaged in the Jewish community. But given that I was being raised in a gender segregated environment, I don't know why, but it just, I mean, we probably know, I just rebelled against it, right? Like I didn't like that my brother got to study Talmud when I didn't get to. And as I grew up, I really understood that, you know, I had a really deep and profound connection to Israel that was encouraged by my family and from our family lore. Like the story I just told is like a cornerstone of our, like, you know, a very central myth in our, or actually truth, but like history in our family. And so when I was struggling with like what my relationship is to Jewish identity, I decided to move to Israel, to Jerusalem, to go to school at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, because I had this idea that like even if I was going to stop being religious in a certain way, I had this model of secular Israeli, right? Like I feel like, and I was like, well, that could be my future. And I thought about making what's called Aliyah, which is moving to Israel. And I spent my year there, and it was 1999 to 2000, which was, you know, a very interesting liminal space time, right? As Daniel was just outlining. And at that point, I had been to Israel many times. I went multiple times on missions with the Jewish Federation with my family growing up, and I had gone with my youth group growing up. And it was on that campus when I got there, one of my early days at Hebrew U, there was a protest, and they were talking about an occupation, and there was a flag waving that I had honestly never seen. And I basically walked up to them and said, like, a land without a people for a people without a land. Like, that's what I had been taught, you know? And so basically I spent that year at Hebrew University really like unlearning and relearning. You know, as Daniel was talking about the elephant, like I definitely was, part of my story was very much like we just focused on, let's say, the tail, right? And so part of my year there was filling out the picture. So you know, for me, that was a really scary time. You know, I really felt like I had been kind of lied to by my family. And I think I later came to understand that they didn't really know either. And about kind of what the circumstances were of the foundation of the state of Israel. So I during that same year, I had a scholarship with the Jewish Federation to go lead Passover Seders in the Ukraine. And part of that experience included going in a van with me and another American college student and some Ukrainian college students. And it turned out some of them had just learned that they were Jewish just when they went to college. Their families were still nervous as when they were children about them even knowing they were Jewish. So it was spending hours in a van, kind of like them asking us tons of questions about Jewish life and us teaching them about Passover and leading Passover Seders throughout southern Ukraine, which turned out where my mom's side of the family was from. So I got to visit the shtetl that my family was from there. And I met a young person who was like one of the only few young Jews still there. Like most of the Passover Seders we led were small gatherings of mostly elderly people. And there was one guy who was younger, and I remember saying to him, like, why do you stay here? Like, why don't you move to Israel? Like, what, you know? And he said to me, and it's like one thing I remember very clearly was he said, well, who's going to take care of the Jewish cemeteries if I leave? And it really struck me. I had just spent the past like 7 months, let's say, in Jerusalem, kind of learning a kind of new history, going into the West Bank with Rabbis for Human Rights for the first time. And now I was here having this other layer of experience where the place that my ancestors came from, we were turning, you know, I myself was being trained to like encourage people out of there. And instead of wanting to like breathe new life into these places where my ancestors came from, was like encourage people out. And here is this person kind of feeling this like huge debt and responsibility there. And like all these years later, that story really like resurrected for me in the Trump years when Jewish cemeteries were being desecrated here in the US. And I thought about that lesson of allegiance. And so when I came back to the US, the kind of third element, right, of my story, I came back and I had one more year at my college in the US, and part of my scholarship that brought me to the Ukraine had me do programming about Israel on my campus when I got back. And when I got back, of course, it was 2000 and the second Intifada was breaking out. And I had an idea to do a peace vigil, like get an imam and a priest and a rabbi and like pray for peace. And they threatened to take away my scholarship. This was in the year 2000. Now that seems like boring news, like everybody, like that's happening every day around here. But back then it was like really shocking to me, right? It was like the people who raised me, like literally the leader of the youth group I was in, took away my scholarship for supporting the enemy by wanting to organize a peace vigil. So those kind of experiences like layered on themselves. And I was like, I got to move to New York where there's all kinds of people. And when I got to New York, I found a group of Jews that called themselves Jews Against the Occupation. And they were veterans of the ACT UP movement, of anti-war movements, of feminist and queer organizing. And they kind of taught me about organizing. The thing is, I wasn't a leftist, right? Like I like showed up at Hebrew U, kind of like a suburban modern Orthodox girl from Cincinnati, right? So I kind of like learned leftism from there. And so from there, I kind of wrestled with my own kind of relationship to Jewish life. I joined Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, in 2000, and that's what brought me to New York. And through that program, kind of got introduced to progressive Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism. And a few years later, when I was organizing, we were trying, in Jews Against Occupation, we were trying to bring the group of Shministim, who are Israeli high school refusers, who are preparing to refuse to serve in the military, on a tour in the US. And I remember calling through like the liberal synagogues in New York, being like, hi, will you host them? And like everybody like hanging up on me. And I remember like hanging up, me and a friend were like making calls to these synagogues, like our naivete. This I think was 2002 or 2003. And then I remember I hung up the last call where Rabbi was not very nice to me for even asking. And my friend said, why don't you go become a rabbi? And then we'll have rabbis that reflect our values. And so I did. And I decided to become a rabbi in the Reconstructionist movement, which provided me the opportunity to learn the Talmud that I didn't get to learn in as good detail growing up. It allowed me to kind of take a long view of Jewish history and kind of understand how Jewish history has evolved. And one of the things that I really took from it was that a real understanding that Judaism as a tradition was built by and for the experience of exile and diaspora, right? Judaism began at the falling of the Second Temple when Jews dispersed, and the rabbinic tradition, which is what we mean by Judaism today, right? Like that's, when we talk about Judaism today, we're talking about rabbinic Judaism. And that was a tradition that kind of understood the spiritual and emotional experience of exile and designed a religious tradition that allowed us to tolerate being in diaspora and exile. And so from there, I kind of decided to dedicate my life to transforming the reality of the solidarity between Jews and Palestinians. When I was in rabbinical school, I spent my summers doing human rights observation work in the West Bank with a group called the International Women's Peace Service, where I kind of monitored settler activity, intervened with soldiers, and kind of put my body in between the Israeli military and settlers and Palestinians. And it's the last thing I'll say as far as my trajectory is that I remember there was one day I was visiting, I was accompanying a Palestinian shepherd whose land had been cut off through a road that the Israeli government had built that then was a Jewish only road. So this was his land to graze his cattle. And then when they put the road down, it became that he couldn't cross to the other side of his land without transgress, right? Without walking on a road he wasn't allowed to be on. And so he was getting shot at as he was working his cattle. And so I was assigned one day just to be with him all day. And I didn't speak good Arabic. He didn't speak good English or Hebrew. And so we couldn't really talk. And so we spent a quiet day where I just was with him. And as I had all that time, the verse came to me, which is like a central to Jewish life, central to my life, which is ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love, it's often translated, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? Every religious tradition has a version of that. But what's interesting about that, I figured out in the long day there, is in the Hebrew, when you say ve'ahavta l'reacha, which often is translated as your neighbor, it actually also means shepherd, the word ro'eh. So for me, it was, you shall love your shepherd as yourself. And I realized that was exactly what I was doing, and the kind of unpredictability that this girl from Cincinnati should end up here in this field, kind of taking a risk, right, with myself in order to protect this Palestinian, because I understood that if my people were going to have freedom and dignity, this person needs to have freedom and dignity. So that's my story.
Tell me why you decided to create Rabbis for Ceasefire, which I think now has about 350, 345 members.
Yeah. So a couple weeks after, I mean, as soon as the the violence started in Gaza after October 7th, like, I knew really quickly to take Israeli leaders at their word, right? When Yoav Gallant said that there was going to be no food, no fuel, that they were dealing with animals and they were going to act accordingly, there was no reason, based on everything I understood, not to take him as his word and understand exactly what
Minister of Defense in Israel.
Yes, right. Sorry, the Minister of Defense. And so, for me, part of I'm a pacifist, personally, right? But even besides that, like, I understand that Judaism is a tradition that affirms life, and that means life for all people, and that affirms the dignity of every human being. And so a couple weeks in, I woke up in the morning to some dreadful, unfathomable news, and just kind of did my usual, like, weeping of despair. And then for me, because I'm an organizer, I go from despair to like action. So I remember I sent a voice note to a group of rabbis, and I was like, we have to just remind Jews about like what our tradition teaches, and we have to invite them into putting down their vengeance and call for ceasefire. And so we did that, and within 48 hours, we put together a letter, and within 48 hours, we had 80 rabbis sign on to it, which was a surprise to me to have that number at that time. This was 2 weeks after October 7th. I really didn't anticipate that many rabbis would be willing to call publicly for ceasefire then. And so once we released it publicly, more and more rabbis reached out of like, add my name. And part of what was going on is that there really was the gap. There wasn't a place for rabbis whose our role, our responsibility, the sacred obligation we take on when we become rabbis is to take care of the spiritual and moral health of Jewish people. And it felt so clear to me what the rabbinic role was, how vital it was in this time. And other existing rabbinic organizations that a lot of these rabbis worked with were not calling for ceasefire. And there wasn't a place for them to live out the sacred like oath, basically, we had taken as rabbis to attend to the spiritual needs of our people. And so we kept building, and we kept adding names. And then we started taking it to the streets, because it was clear that there really was a thirst, like Jews in the ceasefire movement, as you said at the beginning, Yonat, that are, what was once a rupture in the American, was like fissures is now a full-blown rupture. And Jews, I was afraid, were gonna feel like in this moment, that Judaism and their connection to Jewish tradition and Jewish culture and Jewish ritual and using the rhythms of our ancestors as a way to make meaning in life was going to be lost. And so I felt very mother hen, mother berry about Jewish tradition. And I wanted to make sure that Jews in the ceasefire movement had a place to be Jewish. And so we did a shachrit outside of Capitol Hill and a press conference with members of Congress. Then we did Hanukkah, and we kept going and we kept moving, we kept acting because there was a void, there was a need for rabbinic leadership and no other place to do it. And so we've continued to build from there.
And Daniel, moving back to you, the American Jewish community has raised a ton of money for Israel and has supported Israel. I think I read recently that the federations alone raised almost $800 million. So where are American Jews now in relation to Israel, and does that make your work more difficult right now? And also, if you could talk a little bit about NIF's decision to support, to work with World Relief Kitchen to fund food and nutrition programs in Gaza. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I think, first of all, I guess I have come to believe that there's no such thing as an American Jewish community anymore, but rather American Jewish communities, American Jews who go back and forth between different communities. So I'm not comfortable talking about any kind of monolith there. I try to just go with the data, right? And so what we know, you cited some earlier, and I cited some earlier. We know that most American Jews say that they care a lot about Israel, 80-something%. We know that most American Jews, when you ask them, are very disapproving of the Netanyahu government. If we can rewind a few weeks before the last few weeks of political events in our country, we know most, because who the hell knows what's going on, but we know most American Jews were very supportive of what I'm going to call the Biden plan, which is the idea of a regional peace agreement that would see an end to the fighting in Gaza and a return of the hostages and a new regional agreement formalizing relationships between Israel and Saudi Arabia, rebuilding Gaza with the Arab League and the Palestinian Authority playing a role, and ultimately the emergence of a Palestinian state. That's something that the vast majority of American Jews support. Interestingly, parenthetically, I will tell you that is something that 53% of Israeli Jews say they support now. And when you ask people who didn't vote for the coalition parties that I described earlier, which is a majority of Israelis who did not vote for them, that number is between 70 and 80%. So I think there's some interesting richness there. 25% of Israeli Jews only say they support a two-state solution, but 53% support a regional arrangement that would result in a two-state solution. So we should put that into the category of you can never lose hope about things. There's always hope. But with the American Jewish community, I think that you have seen the exacerbation of a split that was pre-existing. And what I mean by that is many of the institutions of American Jewry, which are unelected, self-selected organizations for the most part, have tended to take a position that is either in lockstep with the Israeli government, and for the last 14 of the last 15 years, that has been the successively right-wing governments of Benjamin Netanyahu, right? They, even when privately, many people will tell you how much they disagree with that, there is an inability on the part of many American Jewish institutions, an unwillingness to really publicly separate. That's not true across the board, but I'm talking about the sort of traditional central institutions of American Jewry. There may be some light criticism. There may be, as in the case of AIPAC, no criticism, right? But another ecosystem has sprung up of organizations. I hate to use the political spectrum, the right, center, left, because I don't think it's all that useful. But you have organizations like the one that the rabbi created, right, in the months since Gaza, and then you have organizations like the New Israel Fund and J Street and Americans for Peace Now, organizations that have long stood for another way forward. And now what we're seeing is an American Jewish community that, not surprisingly to any of us who are paying attention, right, comes down much more in terms of the way they see things and what they'd like to see on the part of those, I'm going to call them oppositional organizations. I always think there's a phrase in Hebrew, tochecha, which really means loving rebuke. Rabbi, is that a fair definition of a religious term? And I think that like a lot of American Jews have come to a place where they don't feel any real discomfort in a position of loving rebuke. I love my country, but I do not approve of the way it's going. I love and care about Israel and the idea of Israel, but I do not approve of the way it's going. Those people are not represented by many of the institutions of American Jewry, which find themselves caught in the headlights of an Israel that politically is much closer to Viktor Orban's Hungary than it is to Canada or Denmark. I'm talking about the ruling coalition in Israel, not the country of Israel itself. An agenda that they don't support, an anti-democratic agenda, a fundamentalist religious agenda that the government is promoting, and a sort of declaration from the prime minister that the only option is endless war. And that's not something that most American Jews believe in or want to support, again, parenthetically, nor is it something that most Israeli Jews believe in or want to support when you give them other options. So I think that's what's happened with the American Jewish community. And as to your question about New Israel Fund, I've gotten that question a number of times. What has it been like to do what we do in the months since 9/11? 9/11. There you go, October 7th. But the truth is, the last 18 months since the beginning of what the Israeli press called the judicial coup, the attempt by an elected government to not just change but abrogate the rules of democracy once in power. Right? You get elected and you form a government according to the rules, and then you try to change the game once you're in power. That is what set off the mass protest movement in Israel, which, by the way, has returned. It's not yet at the same strength, but I saw about 140,000 people in the streets of Tel Aviv 2.5 weeks ago. That has resulted for New Israel Fund, which stands firmly against that view of Israel, which stands firmly against the attempt to denigrate Israeli democracy, to annex, to further entrench the settlement enterprise, annex the West Bank, to declare endless war forever on Gaza and the Palestinians. As an organization that supports Israelis and Israeli organizations, some of the human rights organizations the rabbi volunteered with, what we have found is that this has been the strongest fundraising in the history of the New Israel Fund, for people saying there is another way. This is the organization that represents that other way. And when we took the decision to send over $1.3 million of food aid into Gaza, I didn't know how the board of the New Israel Fund, which is made up of Americans, Europeans, Australians, Canadians, and then half of our board is Israeli, both Jewish and Palestinian. I didn't know how the board would react. And what happened was overwhelming and immediate support for this, just as when we said it's time for us to say our vision is a ceasefire and a return of the hostages and a resumption of diplomatic and political resolution of the attempts to resolve the conflict. The NIF community was extraordinarily strongly in support of these things. And when it comes to the aid in Gaza, one of the interviews I did, someone said, a friendly reporter from a source I will not name, she said, she said, so how does it feel? Was it difficult for you guys to do something that a vast majority of American Jews approved of, but the American Jewish institutions and organizations other than yourselves were unable to do? And I said, well, no, it was not, because so many American Jews supported what we did for all the reasons that we've been discussing today, right? Because people were suffering. And I want to just say one last thing. The decision to put significant aid into Gaza itself through World Central Kitchen, which as we were negotiating or talking with them, 7 of their staffers were killed, including one of the people with whom we were communicating by an Israeli airstrike. That decision or the impetus for that decision came from Israeli staff members of the New Israel Fund, one of whom is also the representative of one of the hostage families, a kid who grew up on her block. Her parents the kid is gone into Gaza. She is sort of their spokesperson. She's an official at the New Israel Fund. She called me up and she said, I can't sleep knowing that there are children and innocent people in Gaza who are starving any more than I can because of what's happened to this sweet boy from my my neighborhood, and we must do something. And these things, as terrible and desperate as they are for me a real engine of hope.
I'm going to take a question from our listeners or watchers. There was one question for Rabbi Alyssa from an anonymous attendee who asked why you decided that Rabbis for Ceasefire chose not to state a position on Zionism as opposed to JVP, which is non-Zionist. And the question is, does this signal a new direction we could go in rather than back and forth between Zionism and anti-Zionism?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, the answer, like the straightforward answer is that the reason is because when this coalition of rabbis came together, we came together narrowly focused on the moral imperative to call for ceasefire, right? And so really the purpose was to kind of ensure that everyone who felt called to do so would do so together with us, and that the more rabbis we had sign on together, the more powerful our call would be, right? And so for anybody who's ever done coalitional work, right? Like you got to keep it simple, right? And so, and that was like really that's why we came together, and I think, so that's really the answer. But I think that just to answer the other question that you're asking inside of it is that, one of the things that I see happening in this time, and I think it's going to take years for the dust to settle exactly about how this time has kind of transformed and reoriented, which I agree with Daniel, the multiple American Jewish communities that exist and have always existed here. But I think that one of the things that I'm hoping is that, again, this is kind of separate, I guess, from the call for ceasefire, is the other obligation of Rabbis for Ceasefire, which is safeguarding the moral center of Judaism and protecting it for future generations so that it can be a tradition worthy of our children and our ancestors. And so, to me, it's also important to be leading a coalition of rabbis that are dedicated to that project. Because I think, I think that kind of no matter what one might have hoped to have happen with the state of Israel and with the Jewish state, we are living with the reality of the Jewish state as it is today, as devastating as it is. And because the state of Israel seeks to conflate itself with Jewishness and Judaism, that work of kind of maintaining that moral center of Judaism is really important. So for us at Rabbis for Ceasefire, we kind of see our obligation as that twofold of bringing our moral power of rabbis to the fight for ceasefire, which now, is complicated, right? It's complicated to even understand what does it mean to be calling for ceasefire, right? We have a Biden administration that is calling for ceasefire and sending weapons, right? So those things in my mind, don't go together. So I think that, I foresee and kind of understand that as we go and the rising generations take over leadership of Jewish communities, and we start to build kind of what's next for Jewish life in the US and beyond, there's going to be a need for religious and spiritual leadership. And I want to make sure as many rabbis are together and ready to meet that moment. And that's part of why we are configured the way we are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I could go on talking with both of you for another hour, but we're running out of time. And there were some more questions, but I just don't, I want to respect the time slot that we have here. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you for everyone for listening. We will have a recording of this session, and thanks again for being part of this. webinar on this topic is going to be in the news next week, I'm sure, and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.